Hello, everyone. I'm Martin Jean. I'm director of the Yale Institute of Sacred Music. We're an interdisciplinary graduate center at Yale for the study and practice of sacred music, worship, and the arts. And we're continuing our series of these homegrown, homespun interviews with colleagues at Yale in order to share the gifts of our university with the larger public. And today I'm with great pleasure, Felicity Harley, Felicity Harley, who is lecturer in the history of art at Yale Divinity School and affiliated with the ISM. Professor Harley is an expert in the origins of Christian art, especially in the Greco-Roman world, and especially in the origins of the use of the cross as a symbol in Christianity. Hello to you, Professor Harley.
Hello, Professor Jean. Thank you for having me.
Nice to see you. You
Good to
are
see you too.
down. You are down under right now in Western Australia, and I'm amazed at how well the technology is working.
That's right. We have good internet here in Australia as well. So.
Well, we're making this recording on Palm Sunday morning, and at the start of a Holy Week, which I think most of us who observe these this time will remember as a singular moment in our lives, a Holy Week unlike any other, and it's clearly due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Holy Week has historically been a time when many Christians focus on the suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus. But I will confess that I probably will be meditating a little bit more fervently on the suffering and death part this week because of all the seriousness going on in our world. It occurred to me to ask you what your own research into the early use of the cross as a symbol in Christianity, what insights those bring to you at this poignant time of the year?
Thank you. The insights, of course, are akin to the sorts of points that you raised just then, in terms of even today, this very ancient symbol that remains so universally well known is a symbol very firmly today associated specifically with the crucifixion, and therefore with a mode of death that in the ancient world was extremely violent, associated with a very shameful process of execution. And the earliest Christian communities were obviously very painfully aware of this. And yet, I think, whilst in literary contexts and in community thinking and their intellectual activities, were able to acknowledge that dimension of the execution, they were from the outset looking at ways to grapple with what this momentous event meant. And for the first couple of centuries, in terms of their expression of their faith and use of art and visual forms of expression, there was not the recourse to use symbolism or pictorial images to reflect on that pain and suffering in the way that from the medieval period became core to the expression of the Christian faith. Christians were keenly aware of this horrific dimension of the crucifixion of Jesus and the suffering that he underwent. But what we learn from the earliest visual evidence is that the cross was not used as the central Christian symbol in the way that we have come to accept it as such today. It was not used in this way, as far as the evidence we have, before the 5th century, or before the 4th century, I should say. It was one of several symbols initially that were part of a visual vocabulary, if you like, for early Christian communities. Symbols that many of which were drawn from the visual language that was current in the Greco-Roman world associated with death or the afterlife, but that pertained to hope, what would happen in the afterlife, what the deceased would experience. Symbols like the anchor or the fish is one that's associated with early Christians, but the dove, for example, symbols that might pertain to hope in the resurrection, in the afterlife, and speak more directly to this sense of joy and what faith in Christ and what the promise of resurrection would bring for them. So the cross emerges into this visual language as something that speaks very directly, not to the crucifixion and to Jesus' form of death specifically, but to a symbol that is more associated with an identification of Jesus, of a symbol of protection, a symbol that becomes, yes, correlated with the crucifixion, but which evokes not this intense focus just on suffering, but on what Jesus was able to overcome. The empty cross speaking not to his instrument of suffering, but to an instrument on which he died, but was able to ultimately overcome death. So it's not the Golgotha scene that's pivotal and driving the symbol, but the resurrection and the understanding of these two events as one.
So you're saying that the cross is really part of a repertoire of symbols, and not even the primary one in the
That's
first
right.
few centuries of Christianity.
That's right.
And of course, when I think of the cross, I often think of the symbols of crucifixion, or the crucifix, where Jesus is dead on the cross,
Right.
hanging on the cross. But is that a symbol that you see in the first few centuries?
Not at all. There are no images in the first 2 centuries. Identifiably Christian art doesn't really emerge until around the early 3rd century in any case.
Mm-hmm.
It may have existed. We have no clear identifiably Christian art before then. We have rare images in the late 3rd and the 4th century of a very explicit image of Jesus on the cross, on an amulet, that scholars debate about the meaning of this, as of course all good scholars should. And there's a text on the inscription on the this is a engraved gem that's an amulet that names Jesus. There are clearly attempts to experiment with the representation of him on the cross, but for perhaps different reasons than we seem to assume Christians would do such a thing. We don't often ask ourselves why Christians would want to begin to represent Jesus dead on the cross. Early Christians are not interested in the first 3-4 centuries in representing anyone dead. They're interested in representing the miracles of Christ, of Lazarus being raised from the dead. There's no space within the repertoire for dwelling on the moment of death. There's an intense desire to represent moments of salvation, of being delivered from death or from some terrible situation.
Is this reflected in sort of larger writings, theological writings or liturgical writings that focus primarily on hope and life as opposed to suffering and death?
Yes, I mean, and particularly some of the cycles that are preserved, much of the earliest Christian art is preserved in funerary contexts. So we have to be careful not to apply what's happening in funerary art to assuming that was the theme that covered the whole of Christian art. But in the funerary context, there's a lot of parity between the stories that Christians are interested in representing. So Jonah being disgorged from the whale, the 3 Hebrews in the fiery furnace, the raising of Lazarus. These stories reflect prayers for the dead as well. So there is some connection between the liturgical life and prayer life of Christians and what stories they're turning to provide hope and this expectation.
You're dealing with Christianity that is still essentially underground, right, in the Greco-Roman world, or are you also,
yes,
projecting this into sort of post-Constantinian Christianity?
With the legalization of Christianity in the 4th century, there is a change. So with the Emperor Constantine, there becomes scope for patronage, if you like, of new buildings and therefore new venues for artistic practice in different monumental contexts, fresco or mosaic and so forth. So we do see a shift because suddenly there's a new surge of money coming into Christian communities, Christians moving out of domestic or smaller worship spaces into purpose-built structures. So in that process, there's a change in the content of what we find. And it's at that transition, so across the 4th century is this pivotal moment, really, according to the material evidence that we have that survives, where we see the cross emerge as a central symbol for Christianity, not just one of several symbols. And that might initially, in the early 4th century, that might be the cross is surrounded by several other symbols. By the end of the 4th century, it's the key symbol on an engraved gem on a ring stone, for example. Christians, it becomes the focus of attention. And so that transition, that emergence, if you like, to be the central symbol does occur at a time when other changes are happening for Christianity, so that it's legalized, more people are converting to the religion, buildings are being built, and the emperor himself, and that's an important change that happens too, the cross becomes associated not just with divine power or Christ's power or God's protective power over an individual Christian, it also becomes associated with imperial power and becomes enfolded in the sort of visual accoutrement of what a good Christian emperor embodies.
Do you see the emphasis on hope and salvation, in a sense, kind of going by the wayside after the so-called legalization of Christianity?
No. So in this transition moment in the 4th and then into the 5th century, representations of the crucifixion are still very rare at this period.
Yeah.
But the images that do begin to appear, several engraved gems from the 4th century, but in the 5th century we have 2 representations that survive from this century of Jesus on the cross. And they speak directly to that sense of hope and of victory by showing Christ not dead on the cross, but as alive, and not only alive with open eyes, but physically strong and victorious on the cross. I can show you one of those now, if you like.
Yeah, sure.
So on this series of ivory reliefs that you're looking at, these are in the British Museum. These are 4 sides of what would have been a small handheld casket. So the lid and the base of the casket are now lost, but we have these 4 sides, and you'll see on the top right-hand panel the representation of the crucifixion. So this is one of the earliest surviving representations of Jesus on the cross within a narrative context. So the image is telling the viewer a particular story. Here, of course, the context. This is one of the most important set of reliefs to survive from the 5th century, in that it preserves one of the earliest narrative cycles of the Passion. So we have on the first panel in the top left-hand corner, Pilate washing the hands, Jesus carrying his cross towards Peter, who we see here, who's in the process of denying Christ. These episodes from the Passion all squished into one panel. But then on the next panel, we have the suicide of Judas, who's betrayed Jesus, with the silver coins that are shown at his feet there, and Jesus shown on the cross in an illustration that you'll recognize from the content of St. John's narrative, or the Gospel of the Passion. Mary and John on Jesus' right-hand side, and the soldier piercing his left-hand side with a spear. The spear is now broken from this ivory. And then in the bottom 2 reliefs, the empty tomb, the women mourning at the tomb, and the 2 soldiers asleep. The doors of the tomb have been broken open, and we see through, if you can look closely, that just in between the 2 doors, one is broken sort of through the force of the resurrection, and inside is the empty tomb. And then this last panel in the cycle is obviously the resurrected Jesus incorporating the story of Thomas who doubts and inserts his finger. So this narrative, to go to your point about how hope might still be at the heart of the representation of the crucifixion visually at this period. So the set of ivories were produced in Italy, possibly in a workshop in Rome around 420 or 430, so at the beginning of the 5th century. Here, the hope is redolent, not just in the representation of Jesus alive there on the cross, eyes open, his body impervious to the nails, but also in the focus of the artist here on the resurrection. So 2 of these panels really drawing attention to the fact that although Christ is crucified, he's resurrected, and this forms, half of the cycle, if you like, in terms of its emphasis.
These are powerful images, and the detail, of course, is exquisite. And it must have been a startling sight to see this symbol of this horrible kind of execution turned on its head, as it were, and
Right.
instead of anguished victim violently killed, you see
That's right.
someone who's surpassed and that entire experience.
That's right. So to return to your original question with regard to what this period tells us about how Christians in the earlier centuries were thinking about the cross, is that they were not thinking about it as an event of shame and suffering. One of the standard theories about why, or one of the standard arguments about why there are so few images of the crucifixion before the 4th century is because Christians were too ashamed to represent it. It was such a terrible event, therefore they avoided it actively. And I don't think this is correct. I think this speaks more to what we're trying to search for when we look at the visual evidence for these communities, and we're searching for material that is familiar to us from medieval contexts, as you opened with. We're familiar with Christ's suffering on the cross, and we understand that visual language, and we expect to see it from the outset. But early Christian communities are not interested in this. They're interested in telling that other side of the Easter story, if you like.
Yeah. And it seems to me that the root of that impulse comes from a time when Christians themselves were, well, certainly not popular, but forbidden to practice their religion. And it's in that context of the sort of suppression of their faith that they're looking toward symbols of hope and protection and salvation.
That's right. And coming up with quite a radical image for its time, that completely turns on its head cultural norms of the period of a deity that died. This art is extremely radical in trying to represent, or finding a way of representing, a deity that was executed and yet brings hope and salvation.
Yeah, indeed. These are poignant thoughts for a time when the world is in immense suffering right now, right? And you and I are both experiencing this in our very close quarters here, and my context of New Haven and yours in Western Australia. It's where no one is untouched by the issues that are going on right now due to this pandemic.
No.
I know that in my own observation in the coming week that this will be a comforting and helpful and strengthening kind of thinking as I make my way through Holy Week this year. Thank you for that. And to all of our listeners out there, Professor Harley, who is really one of the world experts on this whole concept of the use of the cross as an early symbol in Christianity. There will be a book coming that we anticipate greatly from Professor Harley, and once there's news of that substantially, we'll be sure to tell that story far and wide. And then also I just will encourage our listeners to keep an eye on our website, ism.yale.edu, for further instantiations of these interviews as we attempt to share our gifts from the confines of our own chambers with the wider world. And of course, we wish everyone good health and good wishes in these coming days, and especially in this Holy Week. Thank you for your time today, Professor Harley.
Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for listening, and prayers to you all, and stay safe.
Yes, indeed. Stay safe from all of us. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.